Welcome back to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington. We're at America's Future Now conference. And now joining us is Alexis McGill-Johnson. She's the Executive Director of the American Values Institute. What does the Institute do?
The American Values Institute is a consortium of researchers and social advocates who are trying to explore how we can reframe the conversation around bias in general, but really race in specific, by using things that we've learned through the world of social psychology on unconscious bias.
Okay, so sort of the last big discussion about race was during the presidential election.
Yes.
And the dispute between Reverend Wright and President Obama. And President Obama gave what was considered the big speech on race, and it was highly acclaimed. But I was a little taken aback by the speech, because it was actually seemed to be a debate between Reverend Wright saying, yeah, there is such a thing as systemic racism, and President Obama saying, well, that's old thinking, we need to move beyond that. So what do you think? Have we moved beyond the idea that there's such a thing as systemic racism?
Yeah, I mean, is the question we're post-racial? Absolutely not. And I think that what our research talks about is that the way we normally talk about race is we define it, or racism, we define it in terms of intent, right? That this person intended to hold me down, intended to discriminate against me based on the color of my skin. And in fact, intent is only 2% of our cognitive process. It's the other 98% of our subconscious that affects the way we behave in our policy profession. It's something that our consumer marketers have figured out time and time again. It's why they place Twinkies at the end of the aisle at eye level for children. And so what we're trying to do is appropriate some of that knowledge in the ways we talk about race and redefine the debate.
Now, how much of that subconscious intent then, because I guess you could say there's conscious intent and subconscious intent, although I don't know if that's a bit of an oxymoron. I mean, if you're in the Old South and you're a slave owner, much of your racism may be subconscious, and it may seem like just that's the natural order of things, but it's based on an economic system called slavery. Yes. So your subconscious is so much formed by your economic interest. So isn't that still the same today? It
is, and I think there's a direct relationship. I think what we're trying to do is explore the emotional connection that people feel around race. I think what's happened over the last 3 decades is that we have tried to individualize the experience of race in ways that, and when we have these big racial moments, it's always, when Joe Wilson yells out, "You lie," it's always, is he or is he not racist? And what we think is that that's an unproductive conversation, because what happens is you enter in that conversation and then you debate whether or not that person's racist, and the fact is that we all experience these biases, right? And that we experience these biases because of the associations that have been created over many, many years going back to slavery.
In fact, we just had something happen in the last couple of days with Helen Thomas. Yes. I mean, it's not being discussed Helen Thomas's view about the Middle East, is that outrageous or not? It's all, oh, now she's a bigot. Yes. And that's the only issue, and she's done with now.
Exactly. So we can never get to the conversation of the larger structural analysis of which Helen was trying to discuss, because we shut the conversation down. I mean, I think the biggest fear, particularly among white Americans, is being called a racist, right? Because that's to the core of what their stated conscious values. I think upwards of 90% of Americans in general believe in egalitarian values. And we would expect that, right? I mean, that's what the nation is founded on. Those are our principles. But the fact is that we all hold these unconscious biases. I'm African American, I'm a woman, I'm racist, and I'm sexist. And it's because of the way we've been primed over many years to think about race and gender.
I had this somewhat similar conversation earlier again about Helen Thomas. Someone came up and said to me, oh, they heard someone talk to someone who heard Helen say something that sounded anti-Semitic. And my reaction was, I actually don't care what's in her heart of hearts. I don't know what it is. I don't care what it is, because who knows what's in anybody's heart of hearts, really. What is their public behavior? What do they say publicly, and where do they stand on things?
I think it's an interesting conversation, and I think trying to explore the relationship between defining someone as anti-Semitic or defining someone as racist, I think it's the same tactic, right? I think what people are trying to do is create anxiety about talking about, maybe speaking to truth about what might be happening, right? Can we have a legitimate conversation with respect to Israel without being considered anti-Semitic. I'm not, that's for debate, because I think that every time people try to go down that road, that's what happens. I think the same thing is with respect to race, right? I think that, Harry Reid might say something kind of innocuous, but a little outdated. I think that John Mayer may say something. I think that, any variety, we can wait for any racial moment to happen, skip Gates. But the fact is that we don't have the right messaging to talk about it in a way that connects to people's emotion. And
how much is that affecting people's assessment of the Obama presidency? That from both sides, you get on one side, well, you're only criticizing because he's black, and then you do get, I think particularly amongst African Americans, but not only, but particularly, if you're attacking Obama, you're attacking us.
Yes. I think he's in a complete conundrum. I mean, I think that, and I don't absolve him responsibility by saying that, right? But I do think that he's being attacked on the left and right. He's really trying. I don't think he's that much different as a president as he articulated on the campaign trail. I think we projected a lot onto him, right? And I think that what's happening now is that, and perhaps it is that through the lens of race, people are seeing a completely leftist paradigm. People are seeing the socialist. People are seeing the Muslim. People are seeing the person that they're projecting is not like us. When in fact, a lot of his policies have been very consistent center right, been very corporatist in my opinion, and I think all of that's being obfuscated.
Well, I was asking you off camera whether some amongst white liberals,
yes,
are they hearing a far more liberal message because it's coming from a black president? Where, I mean, if you actually put it on paper and didn't say who it was, I think you'd have a completely different response to a lot of what he says.
But I think this is what the research in social psychology tells us, right? That we can hold conscious values on some level, but we also can experience this dissonance because we have these different biases that want to lead us in different directions. And I think that's a perfect example. I've never thought of our research in that way, but I think it does explain this, right? That Obama, because we see him as representing kind of reaching a certain egalitarian goal, that we want to believe in everything that he stands for, but in reality some of his actions are leading us away from what we think the center-left position should be, and I think that's something that we have to wrestle with.
Now, the other part of it is unemployment is terribly high amongst African Americans. Poverty is at historic levels, especially amongst young African Americans, and the situation's deteriorating, not getting any better. But he's in the post-racial society, so he doesn't have to, I know he's got the political problem, he's the president for everybody, not just for African Americans, but still, people were expecting him to stand up.
Look, from his own numbers, 7,000 young people drop out of school every single day. Those are the own numbers coming out of the Department of Education. And when we talk about unemployment and the relationship to jobs and opportunity, like it starts right there. And so the challenge with articulating a post-racial vision that may have been arguably a necessary ingredient for a campaign is not something that we can talk about when we're talking about governance and how we're going to allocate our resources. That may have to be more targeted in a universal way.
So in terms of change, I mean, you're not going to have a plan that's going to change everybody's subconscious, but things had better change in terms of employment and poverty and housing and some really concrete issues. So how do you put those two things together? Well,
I think this is the big challenge of our work, right? That what we are trying to do is figure out from an emotional perspective how people are experiencing race so that we can then have larger structural conversations. And I think that is...
So what have you learned so far?
I mean, we've learned that when you put it in the emotional context, when I say off the bat that I'm racist and sexist, I kind of disarm the conversation, right? So now we can talk about how we really feel as opposed to me being in a conversation with you and all of a sudden, oh my God, is she going to call me racist, right? I mean, I think that changes the tone of the conversation that we're having so far. And while the lenses that we tend to look through, whether it's historical or structural, are important for us to understand remedies, I think it's really critical for us to get to how people are understanding or living in an informal way with race every day.
And do you think the president should come out and say, yeah, we're not in a post-racial society, just look at the numbers?
Yeah,
I think be more open and honest about
I think he's got to challenge this notion that color blindness should be our goal in general. You know, I mean, I talked the other day to a friend of mine who has nothing but the best of intentions. She's raised her children living according to Sesame Street ideal, right? And so, you know, when her child heard her grandfather say, you know, a black cameraman came and talked to me the other day, he was offended by the mere description of race in the conversation. And so we don't have a real analysis around race that allows us to have a meaningful conversation. And so if this innocuous 8-year-old can't have that conversation, how can we expect us to get to a conversation about structural racism that we know exists?
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.